Well, thank you for joining with me once again as we continue our journey through the book of Proverbs. And over the last few weeks, we've been looking at chapter 12. We've made our way all the way to verse 16. And Proverbs chapter 12, verse 16 reads as follows. It says, "A fool is quick-tempered, but a wise person stays calm when insulted." Now, the quick-tempered aspect is something that we all have an issue with, in the sense that we don't really know what is really the godly way to deal with anger when it arises in our hearts. You know, when Paul makes that statement in the book of Ephesians where he says, "Be angry, but do not sin," many of us conclude that if we have any angry feelings towards someone, that we're automatically in sin. And the reality is that there are some things that we experience in life that are just going to naturally make us angry. And in fact, there are some things I often like to point out that if they don't make you angry, then you probably don't have a soul that's operative. Because there are some things that are just so sick and wrong and twisted and perverse that any other expression except anger would be a lapse in moral judgment. I mean, when Jesus made a whip of cords and drove the money changers out of the temple, he was clearly and obviously angered by what they were doing. He said, "You've turned my Father's house." First, he said, in the first time, they turned it into a house of merchandise. And secondly, then he said, "You've actually made it into a den of thieves." So rather than being a service that was supposed to help people in their worship towards God, it wasn't something that was unbiblical. It was something, in fact, that was prescribed within the book of Deuteronomy. He said that if you travel a great distance, you can bring money and buy your sacrifice at the place of worship so that you don't have to carry it with you. You can imagine how hard it would be if you were hundreds of miles away or even 10 miles away and you had to carry a sheep with you all the way. And in some way, that if it became injured, or then it would be unacceptable. I mean, it could have created all sorts of different hardships and difficulties. So one of the things that was prescribed about the temple was that you could bring money and you could buy the sacrificial animal when you arrived at the temple or tabernacle destination. But what they had done is turned it into a way of making money for the priests, and particularly the priests who had to basically every 2 years bid for the job of the high priest, and that's a whole different set of issues. But they needed to raise monies, and so they turned this into first an act of merchandise instead of service. But secondly, they began to cheat people who came. They overcharged them. They had to exchange currency, and they would give them a poor exchange rate, or even deceive them because people wouldn't understand exactly what the exchange rate was about. In fact, my wife and I have experienced this when we traveled overseas, that sometimes we haven't really calculated properly what the exchange rate is, and we've been overcharged for things, not horribly significantly, but enough to be irritating. And so Jesus really condemned them, and it says he became angered. And so I don't think that anger in itself is something that is wrong, but he said the thing you need to watch for is that you don't allow your anger to push you into a reactionary behavior where you're no longer thinking about what you're doing. And that's one of the things that makes anger difficult, because anger is probably the strongest emotion, at least overtly expressed, that we have. I'm not saying that love and other things aren't strong emotions. They certainly are. But you can become angry and it just begins to take over and shut down your whole thinking process, and you become overtly reactive. And sometimes some of the most terrible things have happened just because somebody became angry. In fact, I was just reading a news account recently where two men got in a kind of a road rage incident, and they didn't say who was at fault, but one of the gentlemen just took out his gun and fired into the car of the other person and ended up killing a 9-year-old boy. And now he's basically being tried for murder and will probably spend the rest of his life in prison, if not being executed, all because the rage had overtaken him. Now, understandably, people who give in to rage so completely, this isn't the first time they became angry. In fact, there are some people who kind of operate on the ragged edge of rage. They're angry about all sorts of things, and they just find it becoming needing to have a release. And that's why the key to becoming angry is not to react, but rather to stop for a moment and to pray. And that's why I think even the passage just says this phrase, quick-tempered. That in other words, you don't become angered easily or angered quickly. And I would say that one of the things that is really the most devastating thing to relationships is when our anger becomes uncontrolled or it becomes expressing itself too often. See, many times people are emotionally kind of crippled because of their childhood or any number of issues, but as a consequence, they tend to use only one level of emotion. Either they're feeling nothing or else they're feeling anger. And they often find themselves struggling with depression as well, because one of the side effects of anger, once it's been spent, is to become depressed. That's why he says a wise person, someone who's, operating with wisdom, stays calm when they are insulted. Now, I know that being insulted is probably wrong and unfair, but it happens on a regular basis. And, it's funny because we find more and more as people feel the freedom to express their feelings and let people know what they really think about the stuff, they oftentimes react in a way that's really kind of rude and painful and disrespectful and even harmful. And they say things without thinking. In fact, I know that there tends to be a tendency in a lot of people not to realize how heavy their words are, especially in the context of marriage. Because men are used to speaking bluntly and directly and even forcefully with one another. And I fact that even when we tease each other, we also often do it with kind of an insulting in tone in what we're saying. And that's one of the things why he says that you need to be careful that when you're talking to another person, you're not coming across as if you're insulting them in the first place. In other words, we need to have these conversations with a sense of not irritation, but of respect. Because if somebody misunderstands us, we need to take responsibility to make ourselves understood. I know there are some people who you can never communicate with, and one of the things you need to realize at that moment, instead of trying to reason with them, it's better just to disconnect and move on. But at the same time, we find sometimes we're so desperate to win the argument or to prove our point or get our way that our tone begins to change and our temperature begins to go up, and we can become really reactive and we can say things that later on we would regret. So it's really important, I think, when we talk about something like anger, that we really look at ourselves and even ask people who are around us, do I come across in an angry or insulting way? And I say this from personal experience. I grew up in a home where anger was frequently expressed and towards me, and I learned how to become an angry young man. And it wasn't until I got married that I began to have my wife saying to me, you're really speaking to me in a harsh and unkind tone. I was unaware of it, completely unaware of it, because it becomes so habitual and so common that there was such a verbal pugilance in my family when I was growing up that I didn't realize that the words I was expressing were pretty harsh and harmful. I could feel them when they were directed towards me, but I didn't recognize it when I was directing it towards other people. And so it's really important, I think, for us to be listening to how other people perceive us and even ask those questions. When somebody says, what you are so angry, the first thing you should say is, I didn't realize I was coming across as angry. But secondly, not only forgive me, but help me to understand what I'm doing wrong. Because this is a thing that I do on a regular basis, I really need people to speak into my life and help me to understand it. Granted, if you're a mom at home with young kids and they're driving you crazy and you can kind of explode and blow up, well, that happens and it's something that you need to pray that God would help you with. But at the same time, we need to understand that things said in anger oftentimes don't accomplish what we want. They just alienate the people that we want to be closest with. So I would say keep a close look on your anger and basically realize that we need to learn how to be calm and respond in a non-insulting way, a non-aggressive way, to be able to speak very calmly and reasonably. And I would say that if you're dealing with somebody who reacts to you, the first thing you should say is, hey, help me understand what you're trying to say to me. Well, out of time, but I hope this is helpful stuff, because I think this is where, for a lot of us, the daily rubber meets the daily road, and we need to really get a handle on it as followers of Christ.